Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Go Nuts, Help Your Clients and Patients Reduce the Risk of Metabolic Syndrome and Health-Related Issues. I'm Leslie Sine, Director of Professional Development at Great Valley Publishing, and I'm the host for today's show. Before we get started, I have 3 points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your credit, you'll have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, at the end of the session, our presenters will be taking questions. If you have a question, please use the comments box on the left-hand side of your screen to send your question to us. We'll try to address as many questions as time allows. Finally, Go Nuts, Help Your Clients and Patients Reduce the Risk of Metabolic Syndrome and Health-Related Issues awards 1 CPEU in accordance with the Commission on Dietetic Registration's CPEU Prior Approval Program. The responsible provider for this activity is the International Tree Nut Council Nutrition Research and Education Foundation, and funding from non-CPE revenue for CPE planning, development, review, and/or presentation has been provided by the International Tree Nut Council Nutrition Research and Education Foundation. And on to our disclosures. Heidi J. Silver, PhD, RD, faculty for this event, has the following relevant financial relationships to report. She's received grant support from International Tree Nut Council Nutrition Research and Education Foundation, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Merit Award, and she's received funding from the NIH. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Maureen Turnus, Executive Director, International Tree Nut Council Nutrition Research and Education Foundation.
Thank you, Leslie. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Heidi Silver, a research professor of medicine in the Division of Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and a health scientist in the Veterans Affairs Department of Research. Dr. Silver's research focuses on elucidating the role of dietary macronutrients and body composition on inflammation, insulin resistance, and cardiometabolic disease risk reduction. In addition, she has collaborated on the development of imaging protocols to differentiate ectopic fat in organs and tissues and determine its role in cardiometabolic disease risk. Dr. Silver established and is the director of the Vanderbilt Diet, Body Composition, and Human Metabolism Core. Recently, she was a member of the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Committee to establish energy requirement formulas and goals for the U.S. and Canadian populations. She has provided multi-day workshops in 10 different countries and produced several tools that are used by dietitians, nurses, and physicians in clinical practice worldwide. In her leisure time, Dr. Silver enjoys reading novels, making bead jewelry, playing bridge, competing in ballroom dance, and playing tug-of-war with her Bichon puppy, Livy. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Heidi Silver.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I'm going to start with just reviewing the learning objectives for today's webinar. We're going to start out by describing the definition, the prevalence, and the primary physiological and clinical contributors to metabolic syndrome. And then we will move on to determine the role of snack consumption on metabolic syndrome risk, and look at some of our research and where we're trying to distinguish the efficacy of tree nuts as snacks in relation to cardiometabolic risk, and demonstrate the findings of our studies, particularly an intervention done in young adults who are at risk for metabolic syndrome. And then we'll move on and conclude by determining practical ways to incorporate tree nuts into dietary intake to improve overall cardiometabolic health. Now I'm going to go back a little bit to an earlier slide for a second, just to make sure that we're all starting from the same baseline understanding of tree nuts. And so, as stated, tree nuts grow on trees, so they are botanically different from peanuts, which are classified as legumes, even though both peanuts and tree nuts have similar nutrient composition. And so on the slide here, I present to you the different types of tree nuts. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the more commonly consumed ones, like almonds and walnuts, pistachios, but also hazelnuts, Brazil nuts, macadamia nuts, cashews, pecans, are members of the tree nut food family. So to look at some background about metabolic syndrome, it was first defined by the World Health Organization in 1998. And then a few years later, the National Cholesterol Education Program developed a more informed definition of the syndrome, which was later revised in 2004 as a cluster of risk factors. So not a disease, not an illness, not an injury, but just a group of factors that, when converging, increase risk as a syndrome together for cardiometabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes. And in order to be considered high risk and having metabolic syndrome, an individual has to have at least 3 of the 5 risk factors, which focus on waist circumference, high triglyceride levels, high HDL cholesterol, low HDL cholesterol, high blood pressure, and high fasting glucose. And most recently, the cut point for glucose has been reduced to be 100 milligrams per deciliter or greater. What we know from the scientific evidence, and particularly from a number of systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have been conducted, is that having metabolic syndrome increases risk for cardiovascular disease by more than 2-fold compared to not having metabolic syndrome, increases risk for myocardial infarct, for stroke, for cardiovascular mortality, and for all-cause mortality. As I mentioned before, it's a risk factor for type 2 diabetes, and astoundingly increases the risk for developing diabetes by 3 to 5-fold. It also increases the risk for some more common cancers: liver, colorectal, bladder, endometrial, pancreatic, and postmenopausal breast cancer. In addition to that, it's associated with risk for NAFLD, which is now called MAFLD, metabolically associated fatty liver disease, and it's associated in older adults with the presence of frailty by almost 2-fold greater risk. So you can see that there's an enormous impact of having the convergence of at least 3 of these 5 risk factors. Now, the prevalence of metabolic syndrome has been increasing. And surprisingly, we see metabolic syndrome in about 3% of children worldwide, 5% of adults, and almost 5% of adolescents, and almost 1/3 of adults worldwide. In the U.S., the prevalence in adolescents has risen over the past 20 years to now being at about 8.4%, so higher than the global prevalence. And in adults, we see that about 1/3 of our white non-Hispanic males and females in the U.S., and a little more than 1/3 of African American females, and almost half of Mexican American females and males in the U.S. currently have metabolic syndrome risk factors present. So as I said, the signs and symptoms of metabolic syndrome are increasing, and you can see here in this slide the prevalence increase by age group. And up until about 70 years old, we see a consistent, almost linear increase in the prevalence, both in the U.S. and in several countries around the world. And so what's really concerning and what's the focus of the studies that I'm going to present to you is if you look at the data in young adults, okay, that 20 to 39 age group, what we know as the millennial generation, you can see that just in 7 years, from 2011 to 2018, there's been a 6% increase in the prevalence to where it's almost now 1 out of every 4 young adults with metabolic syndrome. So when we look at the risk factors and we ask ourselves, you know, are they all contributing equally, and are we seeing a rise in all 5 risk factors, or are there some that are contributing more to this rise in the prevalence of metabolic syndrome? And the answer is yes. There are 2 risk factors that seem to be increasing more, and that is going from normoglycemia to hyperglycemia, having a glucose level 100 milligrams per deciliter or greater, and central obesity, having a high waist circumference that is reflective of high intra-abdominal or visceral fat. And so those are the 2 risk factors that seem to be growing in their prevalence and incidence most substantially in all age groups, but particularly in our young adults. So let's look at those 2 as key drivers a little bit more. And particularly, let's look at the intra-abdominal or visceral adiposity issue as part of the core pathophysiology of developing metabolic syndrome and its adverse outcomes. It's interesting that the International Diabetes Federation's definition of metabolic syndrome really targets this issue of central obesity and focuses on waist circumference as being a biomarker of high abdominal adiposity. And waist circumference at a high level is the most common component of metabolic syndrome. So if you look at the age group that we're targeting in the purple box, age 20 to 49, you can see that the prevalence of high waist circumference in these young adults is really astonishingly high. And the greatest increase has been in females in the age 20 to 29 group. And this has propelled science to look at whether there should be different cut points with regard to waist circumference and what we consider high and risk, and particularly whether there should be race or ethnic specific cut points. An interesting aspect of this is you might think that, of course, as BMI increases among the population, then it makes sense, it would be logical that waist circumference is increasing. But the evidence that has looked at the 2 has found that if you control for BMI and you adjust for that, the increase in waist circumference is disproportionately greater than the increase in BMI. So this development of excess intra-abdominal adiposity is really concerning because of the way that having this excess fat in that particular depot functions physiologically. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. So normally, subcutaneous fat in any depot, whether it's in the visceral area or it's in a peripheral limb, anywhere in the body has the ability to expand. And this can occur by either individual adipose cells enlarging or by the development of new adipose cells. And it's really genetics that predisposes an individual to which is going to be more likely, and whether the person is more likely to have cells that will enlarge to store more triglycerides due to excess energy intake, or whether the body's going to start having more adipose cells as opposed to larger. And the problem with that is the ability to expand by expanding the size of cells, what's known as hypertrophic obesity, provides a high metabolic risk. And so what ends up happening is the subcutaneous fat becomes dysregulated. It gets to a point, and we don't really know where that point of let's call it point of no return is, but the subcutaneous fat gets to a point where it's not able to expand in a healthy way. It's not able to store excess triglycerides, and that results in the development of what's called ectopic fat. And so what happens is we have this dysregulated subcutaneous fat with a decreased ability to store triglycerides, and there's increased lipolysis, and we get free fatty acids flowing into the intra-abdominal depot, and we have enlargement of visceral adipose tissue. Not only do we have increased free fatty acid flow into the visceral adipose tissue, but we also have increased free fatty acid flow into the portal circulation, which then leads to depositing of fat in the liver, and in the systemic circulation, which leads to depositing of ectopic fat in skeletal muscle. And so then you have this liver that has increasing accumulation of fat that induces a toxic state in the liver of lipotoxicity and enhanced gluconeogenesis. At the same time, in the skeletal muscle, not only do you have this state of lipotoxicity, but you have impaired ability to oxidize fats, impaired ability for insulin to act on glucose and on cells, and impaired ability for glucose uptake. So the two of these accumulated areas of ectopic fat end up in a state of creating insulin resistance. Now, what I'm not also mentioning here is at the same time, we do have ectopic fat being deposited in other organs. So in and around the heart, the pancreas, the kidneys, but I'm not going to talk about those specifically today and just really hone in on what's happening in the liver and the skeletal muscle to create this insulin-resistant state in the environment of excess energy intake and high adiposity and dysregulated subcutaneous fat. So, as I said, one of the key drivers of the pathophysiology of metabolic syndrome is this issue of high waist circumference, which reflects high visceral fat. But one of the big problems of having high visceral fat is that the adipose tissue starts to function differently, and we even see differences by sex in the way adipose tissue functions. And so you have not just more subcutaneous, but more visceral fat, and the changes, the dysregulation of the subcutaneous and visceral fat means that the body loses its protection against the adverse consequences of high adiposity. And so you have this shift where the hypertrophied adipocytes become hypoxic. They start recruiting macrophages, and there's increased development of inflammation because of secretion of cytokines and adipokines. And so you get, overall this insulin-resistant state, And the point of the current slide is to show that, it's really not a black and white type situation, all or none, that the body moves from being highly insulin sensitive to, over time, becoming more resistant with higher and higher blood glucose levels to finally reaching the state of pancreatic beta cell exhaustion and diabetes. So now, where does snacking fit into all of this? So if we look at a little background of snacking, we can see that snacking, just first to define snacking, we're defining it here as an eating occasion between meals. So separate from meals, and not specific to any particular time of day. And what we know is the frequency of snacking has increased in U.S. adults. It has also increased globally. And so here I kind of have a breakdown to show you, about 40 years ago, what percent of the population was snacking. And so about 41% were not having any snacks on a daily basis, whereas now it's only about 1 in 10 people who are not routinely snacking. And you can see that the frequency of snacking, twice a day, 3 times a day, 4 times a day, has increased dramatically in this 40 to 50 year period. What's concerning is the foods that contribute the most to snacking. And so here I've listed in order, based on NHANES data and other U.S. large population study data, the order of foods that contribute the most. And so cookies win that prize, followed by cakes, pastries, pies, pretzels, chips, crackers, and candy. And so this is the trend, that these are the foods that contribute to snacking, that we're snacking more frequently, and the number of snacks per day is increasing. So if we look at, what's wrong with that in terms of cardiometabolic health, and particularly the metabolic syndrome, we know from systematic reviews that these between meal snacks, and the studies I'm reporting here were based on solid snacks, not on like sugar-sweetened beverages as a snack, are associated with increased energy intake, increased body weight, increased BMI in both adults and children. And if you look at the NHANES data, kind of over this same 40 to 50 year period, you see an increase over time in snack calories as a percentage of energy intake, where in the 1970s, those snack calories were about 100 to 150 calories as a contributor of total energy intake less. And so not only is this associated with energy intake, body weight, and BMI overall, but also with this issue of central obesity. So the question becomes, if we're going to snack, can we replace it with something else other than cookies, cakes, crackers, pies, candies, so on? Can we replace it with something that's potentially more healthful, rather than saying don't snack? And so what we've focused on in our research is replacing typical snacks with tree nuts as a snack. So we know from studies that have been done that looked at the biochemistry and the compounds and ingredients of tree nuts, that tree nuts are high in unsaturated fats, that they're nutrient dense with a high fiber, folate, vitamin B6, vitamin E, several minerals, antioxidants, polyphenols. So they have a great nutrient and health density. They also have high taste appeal, so we're not suggesting replace it with something that wouldn't be as appealing. They're convenient, they're readily available. More importantly, in terms of cardiometabolic health, there is evidence that comes from individual studies as well as systematic reviews for decreased blood pressure, decreased LDL cholesterol, decreased cardiovascular risk, decreased mortality, and also this has led to an FDA-approved health claim that also in the health claim importantly suggests to the consumer, how much do you have to eat? Do you need to eat large bagfuls? No. Eating 1.5 ounces, which is approximately 1/3 of a cup on a daily basis, would be a healthful substitution for snacks and a healthful contribution to the diet. So I'm going to review two studies for you. The first study that we did was done only in women who self-identified as either Caucasian or African American. And we wanted to look at nutritional and metabolic effects of consuming a high-fat diet that was supplemented. And it was a randomized controlled trial where we did not attempt to reduce the total amount of fat, but to change the balance of fats being consumed. So our control group, we did not change the balance of fats. The control group was based, so I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. The control group was based on the typical Tennessee population diet. And then the three other groups, we provided the same background diet, but we emphasized one group with more saturated fat intake, one group with more monounsaturated fat intake, and one group with more polyunsaturated fat intake. And the way we increased these unsaturated fat intakes was by providing tree nuts as snacks. So an important aspect of tree nuts is that they're not all necessarily the same. I mentioned earlier that even though peanuts are not tree nuts, they have a similar nutrient composition. But within each nut, some nuts are higher in saturated fats. Some nuts, like hazelnuts, macadamias, and pecans, are higher in monounsaturated fats. And some nuts, like Brazil nuts and pine nuts and walnuts, are higher in polyunsaturated fats. So we were able to choose, which snacks we provided. And we provided, in order to have some control in an intervention, we weren't able, because of funding, to provide all foods for 16 weeks. But we provided all sources of any type of fat or oil that occurred in the menus that we provided. So here's just another sort of glimpse at how we broke down the high-fat diet. It was 50% total fat intake, and we balanced the overall background diet in terms of the high-fat intake, and then we supplemented with our snacks upon that to really emphasize one of the three main types of fat. So here's what we saw. You can see that energy intakes decreased at the end of week 16, that dietary fat intake increased, that the most notable change in type of fat was polyunsaturated fat intake increased. We did have an increase in fat oxidation. We had a very, very mild decrease in resting energy expenditure. Overall body weight decreased by about 6 kilograms. And there was a change in body composition where we did see a reduction in visceral fat. I'm kind of just sort of highlighting some of the key things in the context of what I've discussed earlier. And so this balanced high-fat diet, even with its very high fat intake, really was able to successfully change not just energy intake and body weight, but changed the body composition in a more favorable way by increasing fat oxidation and ultimately decreasing intra-abdominal fat in these women. There is some other prior evidence of what between meal snacking with tree nuts would do. And this is a food modeling study, so not an intervention like ours, but where data from NHANES was modeled. And they used, a composite tree nut. So they made a fictitious nut that was composed of all the tree nuts. And in the pie chart, you can see what percent of each type of nut contributed to this fictitious composite tree nut. The interesting result is that if you ate this tree nut on a daily basis at the recommended dosage, your solid fat intake would decrease, your saturated fat intake would decrease, both types of unsaturated fats would increase, but also your added sugars intake would decrease, your fiber intake would increase, magnesium, and overall diet quality score based on the healthy eating index rose by about 10 points. So both in this food modeling sort of fictitious environment of what would happen to an individual with this composite tree nut is consistent with the intervention that we did in terms of what would happen ultimately with regard to tangible outcomes if you take tree nuts and use them as a substitution for other between meal snacks or a replacement. And this really fits in this concept, in the environment we're in. If you look at, for example, the guidelines from the American Heart Association and how they've changed over the past 40 to 50 years, where we used to be so much more focused on reduce total fat intake, reduce saturated. Our message was reduction, but now our message has become more of replacement. Okay, you don't necessarily have to make major changes, but you can make some fairly easy replacements and have some significant changes, both in terms of nutrient intake, but also in terms of body weight, body composition. And then we'll go on to look at, does that then translate to metabolic syndrome risk? So that's what we did in our most current study. We targeted that millennial generation, aged 22 to 36 years, where we saw from earlier data is the group where waist circumference and blood glucose levels are rising at a rapid and concerning rate. We recruited males and females. We limited BMI to either being in the normal weight category or the overweight category. And they had to have at least one risk factor for metabolic syndrome at entry. So they didn't have to have full-blown metabolic syndrome, but they had to meet one of the 5 risk factors. They also had to be weight stable within 3 pounds for the 3 months prior to enrollment. Like the other intervention study, this was a prospective randomized controlled trial. Again, we had a 2-week run-in period and a 16-week intervention period. And so here's our randomization scheme was stratified by BMI. And so within each of the 2 BMI categories, individuals were randomized to either tree nuts as their snack or carbohydrate snacks, typical carbohydrate snacks. Now I say typical. We still tried to make them a little bit healthier on the carbohydrate snacking side of things. So, for example, we did not provide candy. What we did do was we matched, as best as we could, our carbohydrate snacks with our tree nut snacks in terms of the percentage of energy that would come from the snack, the percentage of energy that came from protein and from carbohydrate, the amount of fiber, and so you see on the bottom half of this slide the ability we had using NDSR to come up with a mixed tree nuts package that would match readily available carbohydrate snacks. And so in this slide, it's matched to 1.5 ounces of pretzels as a snack or 48 cinnamon Teddy Grahams as a snack. And so we had a number of different combinations because we didn't want people to get bored over time with their snacks. We provided all snacks to all participants throughout the 16-week period. And our mixed tree nut snacks, I'm not going to go through all the math, but what we did was we took each of the different tree nuts, we weighed each to find out how much it weighed in grams, we took the energy content of each, and we prepared a snack bag where each tree nut contributed equally to the overall nutrient profile of the snack bag. So it's a very methodological mix of tree nuts, or mathematical mix of tree nuts in a snack bag. And then, of course, we had an overall daily caloric goal, which was designed for weight maintenance, where the protein, carb, and fat compositions were matched for each group so that we would be able to compare our results. The main difference would actually be the snacks and not the other foods. And we designed menus for our participants to follow. So here's our study visit scheme. And in essence, week 0 was when we recruited and consented. Week 2, we brought them into our clinical research center for our metabolic testing, which included indirect calorimetry, a CT scan, an adipose tissue biopsy, diet recall, questionnaires, weight and anthropometrics, and the provision of the snacks. And so then they came in every 2 weeks. They met with our study dietitians, and they got, their next snack bags, either the carbohydrate snacks or the tree nut snacks, for the next 2-week period. And that continued on until week 18, which is the end of the 16-week intervention, and we repeated all the same testing that we did at week 2 in our clinical research center. So here are some outcomes that I'll present to you today. So we ended up with a total sample of 84 individuals, 44 in the carb group, 40 in the tree nuts group. The age ended up being 22 to 37 years. You can see the BMI range. We did end up with some people, we do our screening on the phone, and so they tell us their weight, height, and we calculate BMI. We did end up with a few people in the study who are a little bit lower in the BMI range, 57%, so almost half male, female. We did do physical activity monitoring at baseline and week 2 and week 16, and actually also at the midpoint of the intervention. And our study population was sedentary 65% of the day. And then you see the breakdown here of how many of the 3 to 5 criteria they met at baseline, and what their intakes were based on diet recall report, what their added and total sugars intake were, so consuming about 15 teaspoons of added sugars per day at baseline. And then their tree nuts intake at baseline was about 7% of their daily energy intake. And about 7% of the people actually had tree nuts on a daily basis when they came in. Now, during the 2-week run-in, there was no nut consumption. Not tree nuts, not peanuts, not nut butters, not seeds, not, no sunflower seeds. So 2 weeks of no types of nuts or nut oils or anything like that. So now you can see the baseline groups, the BMI was very similar. There is a slightly, just by random chance, higher insulin level in the tree nut group. And the metabolic syndrome score is a little bit higher overall in the carb snack group, and that is just by random chance. Other than that, everything else was quite similar among the two groups at baseline. So here are the changes. So what I'm presenting today for you, because of our limited time, is just significant changes that occurred, which I have divided by sex. And so you can see that the tree nuts group, as expected, increased their fat calories and decreased their carb calories. They increased their monounsaturated fat. They decreased their total sugars intake. And that was similar, fairly similar in the males and females. The tree nuts group also had an increase in their vitamin E, their folate, B6, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and zinc intakes. With regard to metabolic syndrome risk, the tree nut group in the males, so we did have some sex differences in terms of changes related to metabolic syndrome risk. So what's really interesting is that the males had a decrease in their blood pressure, a decrease in their blood glucose levels, a decrease in their insulin levels, a decrease in their triglyceride to HDL ratio, and overall metabolic syndrome score decreased. The females had a slightly different picture. They also had a significant reduction in metabolic syndrome score, but for them, a large driver of that was a decrease in waist circumference, a decrease in insulin like the men, which trended to be significant but wasn't statistically significant at the 0.05 level, a decrease in inflammation measured by CRP, and similar to the men, a decrease in triglycerides. So what we see is males, it was more of an insulin resistance improvement, and women, it was more of a body composition, waist circumference, combined with inflammation and insulin resistance improvement. So we did do some multiple regression modeling to look at the main effects or interaction effects with sex, and we did see that overall there was a main effect of tree nut snacks consumption on triglycerides, the TG-HDL ratio, fasting insulin levels, and the metabolic syndrome score. And that metabolic syndrome score there was an interaction between the effect of tree nuts and sex. So the bottom line take-home message is that in the females, there was a 67% decline in metabolic syndrome risk score and a 42% decline in metabolic syndrome risk score in males. And a key point to remember is this was achieved in a eukaloric state. So this is without requiring any weight loss in our intervention or without encouraging any reduction in energy intake. Now, tree nuts seem to be a hot topic, and so we did publish our first manuscript. It was in the journal Nutrients, and we've had a wonderful impact. There's been over 500 broadcasts in social and traditional media. So it is a topic of great interest. So I would highly encourage you, those of you that are in clinical or community or private practices, to bring this up, about daily consumption, particularly in the context of the studies, the big studies that have been done really do show that just consuming as little as 1/3 cup per day reduces LDL cholesterol, it reduces total cholesterol, reduces apoprotein B levels, triglyceride levels, and a big study in the New England Journal of Medicine showed that 30-year outcomes of mortality from heart disease, cancer, or respiratory disease were decreased by 20%. And interesting, another study showed a 17% lower risk for depression, which is not necessarily an outcome of cardiometabolic risk, but kind of shows you the potential impact for changing snacking behavior on other health outcomes as well. So in terms of ways you might encourage clients or patients to incorporate tree nuts, you could do it the way we did. You know, we provided snacks, so it could be a replacement for carbohydrate snacks. It can also be added to salads, sprinkled on salads, added to steamed vegetables or a stir fry. You can sprinkle tree nuts on cereals, in yogurt, onto frozen yogurt, onto ice cream. We did not investigate nut butters, but certainly nut butters can be spread on bread, on crackers, bagels, apples, bananas, celery. One thing to consider, of course, is some nut butter manufacturers create the nut butter by adding palm oil, other oils, or some add sugars. And so, of course, reading the labels is very important in purchasing nut butters. You can grind tree nuts and add them to sauces or gravies. You can even grind them more finely and make them as a source of flour in muffins or other baked items. Certainly you can make a trail mix out of them, and they can be added to recipes where they're not already included by adding them into granola bar recipes or recipes for granola itself, or cookie recipes, or muffin recipes, cake recipes, brownie recipes, so on and so forth. And the other thought was I had, of course, is increasing consumption of nuts as nut milk. So I just want to take 1 minute or less, a second or two, to thank my collaborators in my research studies. I have a wonderful co-investigator in John Curta, who's a practicing physician, and my team of research dietitians who work with me on a daily basis: Diana Olson, Michelle Robles, Catherine Sumislawski-Wood, Annalise Widmer, and Kate Lilligard. And I thank them very much for all the work that they do as study coordinators and study dietitians. So now I wanted to leave us time for questions, and I hope that this has been informative and helpful to you, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions, and anything I don't know the answer to, I'm happy to research later. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Silver. This is Leslie back on the line again. That was a fantastic presentation. The Q&A is going crazy, so let's just jump in from the top. The first question for you, excuse me, in the tree nuts and metabolic syndrome study, why did the females who consumed tree nut snacks see a reduced waist circumference and a trend toward reduced visceral fat, but not the men?
So that's a really interesting and challenging question. But I think if we put it in the context of understanding, first of all, that males have higher visceral fat mass. So even studies that have been normalized for body size, for BMI, for total fat mass, males have a higher visceral adipose tissue mass. And there are differences in the function of adipose tissue by sex, particularly in premenopausal women, but in both males and females, that difference in the way adipose tissue functions is based on estrogens. And estrogens favor the expandability of fat cells. And so premenopausal women in particular have more subcutaneous fat with this more favorable profile, and they have less visceral adipose tissue to lose in the first place. But because they have healthier and more subcutaneous fat, they're already protected in the premenopausal state against the consequences of high adiposity. And you can look at insulin. So we saw in the males it was more of an insulin pathophysiology as a biomarker for dysfunctional visceral adipose tissue. And so when you have these hypertrophy adipocytes in the viscera and they become dysregulated, they become hypoxic, there's the induction of recruitment of macrophages, there becomes this state of inflammation and insulin resistance. You're kind of looking at, almost looking at apples and oranges when you look at sex differences that are affected by hormones like estrogen and the way that affects body composition.
Perfect. That's a great answer. Okay, so let's jump ahead on this one because this came up a couple times. During the pandemic, significant weight gain was seen in millennials. Could that be part of the increase we're seeing in metabolic syndrome among this population now?
So I think yes. So what's interesting about this study, it did occur during the pandemic period. So we had actually just started recruitment in December 2019, January 2020, and had just gotten about 7 or 8 people into the study when the virus really broke out, in full form here in the U.S. And so what's interesting is our physical activity monitoring data showed us that people went one way or the other during 2020 and 2021, during the height of the pandemic period. What we saw in our data in this millennial group is that half of our group increased their physical activity during the pandemic, and half of our group decreased their physical activity. Nobody really stayed the same. I mentioned earlier that 65% of the day was sedentary behavior at baseline. And so I think that kind of shows you that people either became more active or less active. And so I think, if you take diet even out of the picture, just that change in physical activity would affect body composition.
Great. Okay. Now we're sort of moving into some questions about the nuts that were used in the study. So a couple people have asked, were the nuts used in the study salted? And if yes, for a portion of your study participants, was sodium intake monitored in these people due to the increased consumption of salted nuts?
So that's a really important key point because so many of the manufacturers and the preparation of nuts is with salt in terms of what you can purchase in stores. But we were fortunate. All of our nuts were donated, and they were all donated in a completely unsalted, raw form. So, and that was very important to us, not only because of sodium intake and the potential for high blood pressure as a risk factor for metabolic syndrome, but we also didn't want any false retention of fluid and a weight gain by starting to eat salty nuts. So these were all completely 100% unsalted.
Excellent. That makes total sense. In that same vein, you mentioned that you used a mix of different nuts in the research. What do you recommend for consumers? So your research is looking at non-salted, so no false positives, no gained weight due to water retention and things like that. Do you recommend unsalted, salted? Do you recommend a single kind of nut or a mix of nuts? If you were advising a patient on what to consume, what would you recommend?
So I would definitely recommend, I always recommend unsalted. And I do point out to clients or patients that if you bought raw unsalted, you can always roast them if you want to enhance the flavor, to have that roasted flavor and have it without the sodium added, certainly without any sugar added. But I recommend a variety because different nuts have a different nutrient composition. in terms of, like for example, I mentioned earlier, hazelnuts, macadamia nuts, pecans are higher in monounsaturated fats. They do have a good amount of poly and a small amount of saturated, but they're the nuts out of the tree nuts with the highest monounsaturated. On the other hand, Brazil nuts, pine nuts, walnuts have a higher polyunsaturated. And so since there's potential health benefits by increasing your monos, increasing your polys, I would recommend a variety of tree nuts to get the best potential health benefit.
Okay. Skipping back to the study, one listener is asking, were subjects allowed to eat fruits or vegetables as snacks, or were they limited only to tree nuts?
So they couldn't, they were not allowed to have any other snacks other than what we provided. So if they were in the carbohydrate snack group, they consumed the carb snacks that we provided. And if they were in the tree nuts snacks group, they consumed the tree nuts snacks that we provided on a daily basis. So there was no other snack eating. And so the answer is no. They could have fruits, and vegetables in their meals, and certainly our menus included that, but not as snacks.
Got it. Perfect. Okay. Specific to Brazil nuts, one listener is asking, is there a risk in eating Brazil nuts daily, or I guess often, since they are high in selenium? To be honest, I don't know. They are high in selenium. I don't know the actual amount of selenium. I would suspect that you would have to consume a very large amount to reach a selenium toxicity level just by consuming, even if you consume a whole cup every day. But I don't know the actual amount. I suspect it's not a real serious concern, though, without going to extreme amounts of Brazil nuts. Okay, that's a relief. In that same vein, then, on the serving size, what's the recommended serving size of nuts per day? So the FDA recommends 1.5 ounces or a third of a cup per day to reduce the risk of heart disease. Is there an RDA or a serving size amount per day that you recommend?
So I don't think the evidence provides us with more information than what the FDA claim states. And I think if you look at, I mentioned some of the bigger studies that have been done. They haven't all been consistent in the amount of nuts in the studies. But like I mentioned, the study where there was 17% decreased risk of depression, that was 1/3 a cup a day. I mentioned the study, big study that the American Heart Association journal Circulation published. That was 1/2 a cup per day. There was another study, a big systematic review in 2015, that showed even stronger effects with 60 grams or 2 ounces per day. So I think that, kind of universally at this point in time, 1/3 of a cup is considered sort of a standard dose. But there is, like I said just now, some evidence consuming even more could have potentially better effects on total and LDL cholesterol and triglycerides.
Great, perfect. Okay, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. What is the best way to store nuts?
So that's a really important point. The best way to store nuts is to keep them as fresh as possible by storing them in an airtight container and putting that airtight container in the refrigerator. And that should keep them, fresh and maintain the taste and the nutrient profile for about 6 months. Or if you put that airtight container in the freezer for about a year.
Wow, that's great. So they do have a pretty long shelf life then.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And personally, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but personally I've found that if I take raw unsalted nuts and I roast them and then I freeze them, they last an even longer amount of time, and still, you know, when I take them out to eat them, they taste just as fresh and flavorful. I've actually stored them up to 2 years in the roasted, when I've dry roasted them.
Wow, okay. And can you talk a little bit about, Dr. Silver, what roasting means? There was a question about the difference between salted nuts and roasted nuts. I know how I do it, but from an expert, I wanted to hear what your process is.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm an expert at roasting. I'm not really much of a cook. but but roasting, you know, dry roasting means not spreading any oils or margarine or butter or, you know, anything else. Just taking the nuts, spreading them out on a roasting pan or a cookie sheet that's dry, and putting them in the oven. I put them in at, so there's one of two ways I do it. I might put them in at about 375 degrees, and then I watch them. You could fast roast them at a higher temperature, maybe up to 450 degrees, but you really have to watch for burning.
That was our last question, Dr. Silver. Thank you so much for joining us. There was such a lot of excitement about today's presentation, and I just want to thank you for sharing your expertise on this important topic.
Thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it, and I hope that everyone enjoyed the webinar. And feel free to email me. I'd be happy to have future interaction.
Awesome. And your attendance certificates are now available to download. You can follow the instructions on the screen or refer to the final slide of the presentation handout, which is this credit claiming slide, for more information on how to complete the webinar evaluation and access your certificate. And the credit claiming email with these same instructions in it will be sent out within the next 24 hours. The presentation handouts were emailed to you earlier today. If you didn't receive that email, the links to download the handouts, Heidi's slides, her contact information, as well as the reference list will be included again in the credit claiming email for you to re-download. And that's the end of our show. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.